fans, and welcome back to the Demonland podcast. My name is Andy, and well, Narrm came crashing down in the torrential Friday evening Adelaide rain and fell short of Yartapuulti by 4 points, spoiling the weekends of Demon fans across the nation and around the world. Joining me tonight to dissect the loss and perhaps provide me with some free therapy is Bin Man. Good evening, Bin Man.
Good evening, Andy. Good evening, Demon Landers. Hopefully, George, you're winging your way back because I'm pinning this loss on you, George, for not being here. Do we know when George is back, Andy?
I have a feeling he is back after next week's game.
Right.
I think that's when he's back in town. So whether he's available Monday night, I don't know. Well, I'll touch base with him during the week and just see if he is. But
if he is, can I request a stinger?
Sure.
Yeah. Cosmic Psycho's BIT back in town, pumping for his. I'll send you the link. Pumping for his arrival.
All right. Well, hopefully we don't get a cease and desist notice from the band.
I'm sure the Psychos will support a footy podcast. But yeah, now I've got on your concerns about the loss and your MFSCSS, is it?
MFCSS.
I've been working on a prototype post flare up. Treating the symptoms, so not treating the underlying cause. That'll be my next phase, some sort of prophylactic protection for you, Andy. But tonight I'm going to. Just a trial, a post, a bit like putting aloe vera on sunburn or something. So see whether I can help address your post-match pain a bit.
I think you're going to need a bigger bucket of aloe vera or whatever you're going to use. I was interstate this weekend for a wedding, as I told you. My wife and I were in Byron Bay without our kids for the first time in 8 years, and the weather was warm and it was beautiful. The sun was shining, and the weekend was all set up, except Friday night came. Win would have been the icing on the cake, but Yartapuulti had different plans, and I didn't, as I told you, I didn't let the loss sour the weekend. After the match, I fully disconnected from Demonland, from social media, and I wasn't going to let my MFCSS ruin a great weekend. It didn't until I sat down last night and today to prepare for this podcast, and all came crashing back. And as I said to you, I haven't watched a second of the match since the game, so I might have to defer to you, Big Man, a lot tonight as I washed away the memory of Friday night's match with a lot of alcohol. So drink responsibly, folks.
It was interesting because you were saying that before. I did essentially exactly the same thing, is that, but for a different reason, I think, because straight after the game, and here's a pro tip for anyone who needs a bit of relaxation. It was such a frustrating loss, wasn't in terms of, but it was a super exciting last quarter. I thought we were going to win the game. That's the thing. That's when it's most difficult. A loss is most difficult when that thing gets in your brain, when you start thinking, near the end of the third quarter, I was thinking, we could win this by 30 points. Of course, I won't take the blame for what happened next. But, so I was thinking that we were going to win, obviously. So the loss made it more difficult. So it was a really difficult end to the game in terms of, it was just awful to lose and all of that. And so I did what you did. I turned off straight away. I could not bear the thought of listening to Gary Lyon do a post-match analysis. And then I immediately started watching the featured group in the PGA Championship. And so if you watch that on KO, they follow one three ball around. And it was Scott. Who else was it? It was Scott and two other players. Adam Scott, the other two will come to my mind in a sec. And because they follow them around, they don't have any other players. So they've got all this dead time to kill while the player's walking up the fairway. And they just have really long shots of close-ups of a creek bubbling or the crowd milling around, or, it's like slow food or something. It's super relaxing. So for the next 3 hours, I zenned out on Adam Scott's round. But the reason I didn't want to watch it, any media or go onto Demonland is I couldn't be bothered with the the inevitable, Melbourne are going backwards, what's happening, the season's collapsing. I just couldn't. I knew it was that would cause me more angst than the loss. So I have deliberately stayed away from it mostly. I've gone on to Demonland a few times, and there are lots of, in the very short time I've been on there are lots of those sorts of posts, and I couldn't. I watched none of the football analysis over the weekend. I thought, that's a bit silly, and I started watching First Crack on Sunday night. 5 minutes in, King, and we're going to talk about it, raised an interesting point about the lack of support for Maxi when he and their Port strategy against Maxi, which again we'll get into, infuriating part of that aspect. But then he, I thought, oh yeah, that's a reasonable point. Then he starts saying, I'm really worried about Melbourne. At that point, I just got the remote control and turned it straight off. I thought, oh, God, it's just like, this is a guy 2 weeks ago saying we're cruising, blah, 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 blah. It just does my head in. So I'm pretty fresh. I'm not sort of filled up with other people's analysis and stats. So I'm looking forward to get into it.
Well, you were trying to avoid the negativity, so and you told me before that you didn't really have a look at the questions that we've got incoming tonight.
I did in the thread. That's why I was on Demonland actually yesterday, because to be perfectly honest, I forgot we were on tonight. So I sat down ready to go and I read the questions. That's why I was on there. So I have looked at them as they've been put up on Demonland, which is really, really helpful. It gives me time to think about it. I think they're great questions. So that touches on some of the key points from the game that we'll cover, including Maxi. And I'm increasingly getting furious with the treatment of Max. It just, for God's sake, all of that drama around JVR. And what did I say that week in the podcast? Well, can we see, 4 or 5 players getting reported each week for thumping Max in the back of the head? It happened 10 minutes into the game. Maxi got up. Did you see him? He's holding his jaw, basically.
Yeah.
For the next 5 minutes, he was clearly distressed with his jaw. It's like, it is so frustrating. Like, where's his protection? If the head's sacrosanct, well, don't let players hit him in the back of the head. It's outrageous. And I actually agree with King in terms of that lack of support. I wonder actually whether it happens so regularly that, that's not a new thing, what was happening. The bumping is this thing of bumping him and going back, which another thing that comes up with that is that they didn't know whether that's legal or not. I don't think it is legal, is it? So, isn't that blocking? If you're running towards a marking contest and can't get to it because 30 metres off the ball, a player blocks your path, how's that any different? And you can't get to the marking contest. How's that any different from blocking a player 5 metres from the contest who can't get to the marking contest?
Well, he got that, and he got a free kick after a goal, like a free kick from the centre, because they blocked him from going back to the centre.
Yeah, it's so. Yeah, that the treatment of Max Gawn is infuriating, and I'm amazed there's not more noise about it. We want to protect players' heads or not? It's a joke. It's a complete joke.
All right. Well, we will get into that a bit later. We do have a caller on the line. Welcome to the Demonland podcast. Who am I talking to?
Good evening, Andy. Good evening, DJ Binman. It's Kieran from Canberra. How are we?
Good, Kieran. How are you going?
Yeah, I'm going really well. I just listened to your intro, particularly the turning off and the inevitable thoughts of the demon faithful and worrying about us. And I'm wondering if you could indulge me for a few minutes with my thoughts, if that's okay.
Of course. Go ahead.
So I just want to share my thoughts on the Redlegs as a whole for circa 2023. And as a club, we're in rarefied air. A men's, women's and VFL premiership, all within the last 2 years, a recruiting, administrative and conditioning team that made impeccable decisions for almost 10 years, the highest paid up memberships in the history of the club, a pool of generational talent signed up to long-term deals, a strong list of youngsters pushing our best 22 for team selection, a destination club that has attracted all Australians' best and fairest previous club captains, a team of A-list assistant coaches, a coach that has tasted the high success in his playing career and now as a head coach, and not only learnt from a genius and passionate Demon fan in Paul Roos, but is young enough to relate to his players young enough to grow with these players, and young enough to be around for another decade, which creates an environment of trust and cohesion. If you think back to your amateur sporting days, be it AFL footy, local cricket, or even indoor soccer, when did you as a team create success? When you had consistency and cohesion and trust. When you had the same 22 fellas running out to kick the Sherrin, the same 11 blokes going out to field, the same 5 blokes putting on a shin guard. Why? Because you built patterns, game plans, and trust in their abilities. You could anticipate what your teammates were going to do and when they needed your help. The D's finally have this: stability, trust, and importantly, genuine class. What we don't have is a recent history of it. They're learning to be successful, just as we as supporter base are learning with them. We're not used to this success, being the favourites to win every game, being in every game, no longer being thrashed every week. But what I consistently see when I read frustrated fans' posts on various platforms is that we should be better. And it's this word I'd like to analyse. Better than what? Is what I would like to ask. Is it possible to win every game? Of course not. Is it possible to only lose 4 games in a season? History would suggest not often. It's been decades since we've had this kind of heat. Teams need to play at their very best to beat us. So each week, we're playing the very best the opposition has to give week in, week out. It simply takes a toll on the boys. You can't be up every week. You simply cannot be better all the time. It's not an excuse or a defeatist attitude. It's a fact. We all know the cliches. You don't win flags in any month except September. You have to peak at the right time. You must finish top 4 to win a flag. And they're cliches for a reason, because the better teams have fulfilled these cliches better than other teams. As Bin Man says, if you have all the pieces in place, as we do, talent, good governance, etc., the key determinant is injuries and increasingly suspensions. These are not things to concern yourself of, not the team itself. In the cut and thrust of battle of the home-away season, it can be hard to pull back and see the bigger picture. And what is it? The future has never been better. It's okay to be angry at losses, but let's get behind them rather than walk away. Let's be that club that turns the umps' whistles our way with our own noise of affirmation. Let's continue to pay our membership, to buy whatever merch we can afford from the Demon Shop, to assist the club to find a spiritual home for us to congregate. Not Casey or Gosh, but a real home. And let's not feed into the collective anxiety that if we don't win a flag in the next few years, we never will again, but rather strive for sustained, prolonged success, because then the flags are inevitable. Simply, my point is trust in this team, this collective organisation. The club has never been in a better position, and if we can't enjoy this now, when can you enjoy this team? Thank you, Andy. Apologies for taking so long.
No, that's very very well said. Loved it. I wish I could have some of that positivity. I sometimes have it, and as you well know, I sometimes don't, or more often don't. But I wish I had more of it. B-Man, what do you think?
Awesome, Kieran, and that's many of those points we'll touch on through the night. But I think it's an interesting point about a fan base who's. This is an unusual position for me. I mean, there was sustained success at different times in the 2000. It was great. Never as good a team. This is by far the best team, since I've started barracking for the D's. So it does get it's interesting getting used to the victories. You tend to look through everything through Demon's eyes, obviously. But just one example of what you're saying of success, Geelong by any measure, Geelong are a successful footy club. They've won now their second flag in, 11 years? Still would be considered a successful club. I've got Geelong friends who, bemoaned their lack of success in the last few years, but are a lot less stressed about it, obviously, because they even with the one flag. But one of the truisms of footy is that every year you copy you look at what won a flag last year. And what were Geelong at this point of the season last year when it was 6-4 or something, wasn't it, Andy? Or
it was around about that, yes, maybe.
Yeah, so, everyone looks to the Premier and takes from the Premier what worked for them. And what worked for Geelong last year, as D's fans on Demonland were, at pains to point out during the season, were a few things, is how well they managed their stars, how their use of rotation, moving players in and more players through the midfield, giving their rucks a chop out, not being too up too early and being better in the second half of the season. They won 13 games straight to win to win the flag. If you were objective and just looking at the trajectory of our season compared to Geelong's, it looks like we have taken some of those exact lessons and applied them to our season. We don't want to be perfect at this point of the year. in any case, it wasn't such a terrible match. It wasn't, we got beaten by 4 points against Port in front of a rabid Port Adelaide fan base. So, there's lots to like about the game itself, not much to like about the result. But so yeah, good call,
Thanks.
Kieran. I'm on board.
Thank you, positive bin man, positive DJ business bin man. Thank you. And Andy, it's okay, mate. It's okay. Enjoy it. It's never been better.
I know, and you know what? I think I'm just being greedy because we had that success, and I just want to win every week. That's.
But we're going to be good for a long time. We're going to be good for a long time. Everything is in place. You know what I mean? Like we've never administratively been better. We're just not used to it, and I think that's the thing the club's trying to come to terms with, and the supporter base is. And it's that juxtaposition right now until we are able to take that big sigh and go, it's okay, we're going to be fine.
Well, I really hope so, and I love it. I love the positivity. Anything else, Kieran?
Go Redlegs. Thank you. Sorry for taking up so much of your time.
No problem.
No, well, Kieran, terrific. Cheers, mate. Keep warm up there in cold old Canberra.
-5 tomorrow morning, mate.
Oh, sounds lovely. I was 23 degrees on the weekend up in northern New South Wales. All right, mate. Take care.
See you, lads. Till next time.
Thanks,
Bye.
Kieran. A related point that I was going to say later, but I'll say it now just because it piggybacks on what Kieran was just saying, is that I find it curious the way the media too, to an extent, but footy fans, or at least Demon fans, as far as I can see, on using Demonland as a some sort of gauge of that, of looking at each game not in isolation as a game of footy, looking at each game as some sort of measurement or assessment of our chances of winning the flag this year. And despite the fact that everyone in footy, it's one of the biggest cliches of footy is it's a long season, it's a marathon, not a sprint, all of those sorts of truisms. We're 6 months or 4 months away or whatever it is from when we need to be peaking. The best teams don't peak. We talked about this last year, is that in Richmond's Flags years, their best season at this point of the year was the year that they got bundled out by the Pies in the in the prelim. So when Cox went nuts. So the premiers generally aren't flying at this point of year. That's what history says. And so each game isn't, as I've said a couple of weeks ago, each game isn't a referendum on whether we're going to win the flag, which is why the odds for the flag don't jump around like crazy after each game. It's not, I think it's just a sort of, it's an unhelpful way to look at the season in some way. Of course, you want to take the lessons. Of course, you want to say, well, what are the risks? What are the concerns? And there's definitely some concerns that I'd flag from this game for our chances of winning a flag. But this game in of itself doesn't have much meaning in that sense.
Yeah, I know, but there are some worrying signs that we're going to get into a bit later. Our record against top 8 teams is a big red flag for me, and we'll get into that a little bit later. But before we do that, each week I ask our loyal listeners to help us out by leaving us a 5-star review and a comment on Apple Podcasts or on your preferred podcasting app. We love the feedback and we'll read them out on the show. Demon Dave says, fantastic perspective. Can't wait for this podcast to come out each week. It's the only footy podcast that helps me understand and feel better about a loss or bask in the joys of a win. Andy, George and B-Man have good chemistry together and are always well prepared. I also love the deep and insightful interviews throughout the year. Well, thank you, Dave. Big Jimus says, she's a beaut, top-tier analysis and cautious optimism from 3 blokes with their hearts and heads in the right place. Gets a nod from my mum, who tunes in and week out. Says she appreciates the tone. Well, thanks, Jim, and thanks, Jim's mum. And now I went back a few weeks in the reviews to check that I hadn't missed any. And, well, the deal always is that I read and give a shout-out to any and all 5-star reviews. And back in early May, we received a 4-star review. Imagine that, Bin Man. And I was reading it, and it was very complimentary, and I was wondering why we weren't given the 5 stars based on such a nice review. So I'm not going to give the shout out by name because he did break the deal, but I will read out the review because he had some very nice things to say. Have been listening to you guys for a number of years and finally became a member of Demonland last week. Love my Monday nights listening to quality, well thought out observers of our great team. Now, I'm hoping that the 4-star review was a mistake, a slip of the finger or something, and I'm happy to give the shout-out if he bumps it up to a 5. You probably know who you are.
Andy, you got to give him a shout-out.
No, 5 stars. You give a 4-star and the rating goes down, B-man, and then people think we're crap.
If it's a 4-star, it's a 4-star. You don't give anything a 5-star. Like, where do you go from there?
Well, 5 stars. We're the best. And that's the deal.
Well, maybe make it out of 6.
It's my house, my rules. If you follow us on Facebook, Instagram or Twitter and you want to leave us feedback or post a question or a comment for the show, you can post under our podcast post each week or just slide into our DMs. We won't read out your full name on the show. If you want to chat with other D's fans and you've never been to our forum, head on over to demonland.com, sign up and you can chat with other D's fans from around the world. It's completely free. In addition to being able to post questions or comments for the show, there are multiple topics and threads on all things Demons related. So join up to join in on the conversation. I assure you, it's far superior than anything you'll read on social media. If you'd like to join us on the air tonight, like Kieran just did, please give us a call on 0390163666. That's 0390163666. I'll answer, put you on mute, then bring you on when we can. During the week, you can give that number a call, leave us a message, we'll play it on the show. If you're listening to us live, you can join us in the chat room. Go over to demonland.com/podcast. We're live every Monday at 8:30 p.m, except obviously tonight. If you've downloaded this podcast, want to listen to us live, please join us on Mondays at 8:30 p.m. at demonland.com.
Dissecting the rounds match from the depths of the game that was, it's over to Andy, Binman and George with the match wrap-up.
Well, the much-vaunted midfield of the Narrm Football Club came crashing to the sodden earth of Adelaide Oval at the hands of Yartapuulti's young guns. The power dominated 3 scintillating quarters of magic headed in the midfield by Zach Butters and Connor Rosé. There were a few magical party tricks from the makeshift Yartapuulti forward line, such as Sam Powell-Pepper's goal over the shoulder early in the game and Rosé's late match winner. A controversial mark paid to Ollie Lord that appeared to have touched the grass helped the home team, as did some questionable free kicks, as well as after the siren goals at the end of the first and third quarters. When push came to shove, Yartapuulti grabbed the limelight on AFL's Friday night stage. As for Narrm, they had just 1 quarter of glory when an uncharacteristically quiet Christian Petrarca, together with Clayton Oliver and Jack Viney, restored life and clearance dominance to the team. They surged with 7 goals from a game-high deficit of 25 points to a 17-point lead in the driving rain. It was also the only period of time in the game when our defence, led valiantly by Stephen May, wasn't under siege. Unfortunately, a couple of late frees in the third that culminated in the last-ditch goal gave succour to the home team. The Demons' final term was weak, with some poor decision-making that let Yartapuulti back into the game and rewarded them with their ultimately well-deserved victory. Overall, there were far too many passengers among the Narrm small brigade up forward that were missing in the wet. The taller forwards were often caught behind during the first, second and last quarters when the game was won and lost. The ultimate 4-point final margin was very flattering, to say the least. So the team and coach Simon Goodwin have some work to do with a very tough month ahead with matches against Wallyallop, Carlton, Collingwood and Geelong. And if it doesn't revert to a more desperate kind of play, we might well lose touch with a top 4 berth. B-Man, do you have anything to add that you haven't already? Otherwise, we can move on to your stats.
Just before we do the stats, I just want to trial this for you, Andy, to see whether this post-MFCSS treatment is helpful or not for you. It's I've got your well-being at heart here. So if these are yes or no, I want you to answer yes or no. Don't think. Just give me your answer straight away, and then I will collate your information and put it through the Binman computer and come up with a treatment plan for you by the end of the show. So just quickly, yes or no. Don't think. Just give me the answer. So we'll start. Did you think we would win the match beforehand, Andy?
Yes.
Are the D's suspect in slippery conditions?
Very much so.
Was it slippery conditions throughout the night?
It was.
Yes or
but
no?
No. It was. But before the game, I didn't realise that it was going to be wet.
Nor did I. On Demonland, someone wrote that it was clear and there was no rain on the radar, we were favourite. And I thought as soon as the rain came, to be honest, I had them favourite.
Yeah. So that's what I'm saying. Before the game, I saw my app with the weather. I looked at precipitation. There was this tiny little dot at sort of 5 o'clock or something. And I was not expecting the torrential rain. So, the conditions,
Maybe that was the
everything.
biggest factor. To be honest, that was yes or no, Andy?
You're breaking the rules. Yes.
I just wanted was it slippery throughout the night?
Yes.
Does our system work best when we're clunking marks? And is clunking marks key to us controlling territory?
Yes.
Did the wet, slippery conditions make marking hard?
Yes.
So therefore, it's logical we would struggle to win territory.
Yes.
How many players under 21 did we have in the team?
Oh, that I don't know. That's not a yes or no answer.
I guess. Oh, that's true. Good point. Did we have many players under 21 in the team? Yes. Is it accepted at this point in the season teams start to fatigue, as evidenced by the low-quality matches at this time of year every year, including this round, which was appalling?
Yeah.
Is it accepted? Yes. Is it logical to expect younger players to feel more fatigued at this point in the season than more senior players?
Oh, yes, I guess.
Did our young players struggle in this particular game?
Yeah.
Yeah. Were we? Do you accept a 6-day break and travel negatively impacts performance?
Well, it obviously does and we've travelled. That was our sixth. I want to say that's our 6 out of how many games we played now? 10.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, that's our 6 weeks travelling interstate. It's got to have an effect. Well,
I didn't actually have that question on there, so that's another question I'll ask. Does a long series of a tough first half of the season would make fatigue more likely at this point in the season? And remembering Selwyn Griffiths emphasised by this point in the season in our interview with him how basically they're out of gas at this point of the year and they're starting to look about how they refill the tank.
Yep.
Did one of our 2 best so we were coming off a 6-day break. Did one of our 2 best mids, his name's Petrarca, come into the game with an ankle injury and then only attend a very small number of centre square clearances, 11-2 I think it was in the first half?
Yeah.
Do you think it's likely that he was carrying an injury into the game?
Absolutely, and it makes me terrified that we're now he's injured and he'll play and Clary's not. That worries me a lot.
Did Clary damage his hamstring at the end of the last quarter?
Are you supposed to be curing my MFCSS or making it worse? Because I'm not happy.
Did he damage his hamstring?
Well, I only found that out after the game, but yes.
But is it logical that he then would struggle in the last quarter?
In hindsight, yes.
In hindsight. So we had Oliver. Did we have Oliver Track, our 2 best midfielders by a country mile, basically running on one leg each in the last quarter, and our fleet of small, our younger players, Cozzy, Rivers, McVie, Van Ruin, who lost his head, all struggled, then it's a loss, really. If you were putting money on that game, who in those circumstances would you think were going to win that match?
Well, that's not a yes or no question, but yes, Port.
That's true. Port. That's exactly right. So, I mean, it's exactly right, Andy. So there's no need to be too stressed about the 4-point loss. All of those things, 4 points is remarkable. The expected scores was, they played better than us. They deserved that win. The expected scores was they won by 27 points, I think, was the expected scores.
They missed a lot of set shots for goal. So they could have won by more.
Well, and they had the umpires in their pocket as well.
Absolutely.
So my point of all that is that given the circumstances, that's a pretty meritorious victory. And in the stats here, I'll talk to some of the positives and highlight some of the negatives. So, all jokes aside, I think that it's very easy to, because how disappointing it is to lose, when we see the D's lose, is to have it all wash away and not put it in its proper context. I'm sure the club is putting it in the proper context. The betting market is putting it in its proper context. To walk away with only a 4-point loss with all of those things against us, and I didn't even talk about the fact that we had the umpiring was just completely terrible in our way, or the fact that we were playing on their home deck in front of, 35, 40,000 Port fans. So you add all of that stuff up and come away with a 4-point loss. That's meritorious, which is not to say there weren't issues, of course. But, I think that the sort of, wrist slashing, woe is me, train crashing, gifts, all of that stuff, is a bit hysterical, to be perfectly honest.
Some of the numbers are spooky. Some can't be explained by conventional means. But that won't stop the boys from trying. Coming up now, it's the Demonland Stats File.
What do you have for us this week, big man?
All right, so I'm partly connected to what I was just saying. I just want to sort of run through some of the key stats again. Thanks to Willow for pulling these together, and I've augmented these stats that he's put on Demonland in a thread called the Stats File. I've augmented them with some of his stats from Willow ratings, some of my own notes that I took during the game, and also some other bits and pieces for this picture. So, again, the focus on the key stats for Melbourne: contested possession, time in forward half, scores from turnover, and inside 50s. They're pretty much our key stats. So I just want to speak to them. The other one, of course, is pressure. Just on pressure, I was going to talk a little bit about pressure tonight, and I talked a few weeks ago about how I think that fitness has become just an incredibly critical aspect of the game, and increasingly people are talking about it, which is terrific. The other thought I had was it occurred to me over the weekend listening to post-match presses and interviews with players is how many of them on the winning side mentioned their pressure, and how pressure has become ubiquitous now in terms of the critical nature of it. And I was going to say, so it was quite coincidental, that you really have to give credit to Hardwick and Richmond for bringing that into the game, because of course pressure's always been important, but they shifted it into a different direction where it went from being important to basically it is a fundamental now of the game. And so it was a curious coincidence that Hardwick quit this week. So I thought pressure's a critical thing. So the first stat that was interesting about pressure, so one of the things, if you didn't see any of the pressure rating because it was on 7, that wasn't showing up on the screen, is you might think that we didn't perform that well in terms of the pressure we brought. I mentioned last week on the show, we'll be able to tell 10 minutes in, and 10 minutes in our pressure was okay. So first quarter, the pressure rating, remember, anywhere above 200 is elite, 180 is the AFL average. So that first quarter was 182 for us, 203 to them. And I thought that they were definitely better in that quarter, but 182 is not terrible, but it's not finals like pressure. Let's say, for the sake of argument, 200 is finals like pressure. The second quarter was their best quarter, it was an excellent quarter for them. It was 200 for us. Our pressure rating was 200 for that quarter. Theirs was 203. That's a phenomenal. For, both teams breaking 200 in a quarter of footy, notwithstanding they had a better quarter than us. That's an incredible pressure game. So, for the neutrals would have been thinking, wow, this is incredible. The third quarter was 189 to 198. So, which was, I found curious because that was the quarter that, of course, we dominated, but they still beat us by 9. Now, 189 is still nothing to sneeze at from us. It's above the AFL average. Quarter 4, when you might think that we folded up a little bit in the quarter because of the domination that they showed in that quarter, and that's how lots of people would look at this game. The pressure rating in that quarter was remarkable. 205 to us, 219 to them. 219 in the last quarter of that game. By Port, you've just got to hand it to them. I mean, that's phenomenal. That is incredible. But it's not like we wilted. It's not like we weren't, we weren't continuing to really, really go hard. So it was 205 to 219. The total for the match, they averaged over the match 205 pressure points, and we were 194. By any measure, that's an impressive effort by both teams. So, I think that's good to push back against this thought, well, Melbourne didn't turn up. We did turn up. what was really interesting was the pressure points for the individual players. And this really speaks to my point about young players struggling at this point of the year. So our top pressure player, despite the fact that he did his hammy at the end of the third quarter, and so basically was playing with a torn hamstring in the last quarter, forget strain. There's no such thing as a strain. It's a torn hamstring, was Oliver with 85. Next best jumping down, Petrarca 65, Viney 63, Neil Bullen 55, Pickett 50, Brayshaw 49, Chandler 40, Salem 36, Rivers, McVee 32, Spargo 31, McDonald 30. So apart from McDonald, who that's a pretty poor rating, and it's not even on that list, is JVR. So, really the younger players really did struggle in this game with their pressure rating. That was really clear. The big stat for us, and because this stat isn't recorded, I didn't talk about this in our preview of this match, is that I didn't realise that Port were the number one team for time in forward half in the AFL. So they play our brand of footy in one respect. That's a key indicator for them. It is for us. How they get it there is different that we play differently in that sense. And Willow put these, which was really helpful. He did it from Channel 7. So he's looking at the rating as his calculations for time in forward half. So the overall match was 39-61, which is crazy their way. That is a shellacking for us. So again, to only lose this game by 4 points when they had 61% of the ball in their forward half is really extraordinary. So the quarter breakdowns was 45-55 in the first quarter. So we were on track then. That was okay. 33-67 their way in the second quarter is when they really got on top. Not coincidentally, that's when it started raining. 51% was almost equally split, 51-49 in the third quarter, and then 32-68. They smashed us in the fourth quarter. What was really interesting about that fourth quarter is that it was 10-1 with 10 minutes to go on the clock. They were 10-1 up at that point, and we then won the next three and went point to the rush point to Hunter, goal, McDonald's goal, and then Chandler missed that goal. I reckon Chandler kicks that goal, we win that game of footy. So they went 10-1 with 10 minutes to go. It only scored two goals in that time, but we turned it around and when we scored from the next three, but unfortunately we only got the one goal from out those three scoring. This was interesting that Willow's point, I thought he makes, based on the calculation, the second and fourth quarters ranked as two of Melbourne's three worst quarters of the year for time in forward half, which was really curious. So I looked at them. So it was 31.6 against Port Adelaide was not our worst result in the fourth quarter. Quarter one against Brisbane was 31.8% to us. Port Adelaide quarter two. And then interestingly was quarter one in the West Coast game. The Port Adelaide game and the Brisbane game were both wet. And the other two, quarter one versus Essendon, 39%, quarter two versus Essendon. So both those games were all three of those games were wet. The other one, West Coast, wasn't wet, was it? Do you recall?
No, it was a beautiful day. The Brisbane game wasn't wet. It was slippery conditions because of the dew.
Slippery, yeah. So slippery, let's say slippery. So all of those games, the West Coast being the outlier there. So I went and looked at the stats for the West Coast game. They had 40 more uncontested possessions than us, and they really obviously looked to keep the ball off us. So maybe that was a factor. But I was curious that our time in forward half has been worse when the ball's slippery or when it's genuinely wet, dewy or slippery. And so it got me thinking about why that might be. And one of the key things for us is that we score on turnover. We score from the back half, number one in the AFL from scoring on turnover, number one in the AFL from scoring in the back half. But the way that we do that now is we chain out with forward handballs. They're really, really, really difficult to do in the wet. That's what broke us down in this game. We could not connect we could get no overlap run. Our pressure was okay. They went to town on that. It makes it really hard. I think there's also a genuine question is that, we're fumbly, aren't we? I mean, I think that's probably the knock on Oliver and Truck in terms of two elite players is they both make some key fumbles. Nibbler made some key fumbles. But that's going to be exacerbated by the wet. So I thought it was really curious that our worst performing quarters for time in half were on nights where, except for the West Coast game, were on nights where it was either super dewy in the Brisbane game or wet in the Brisbane and the Port and the Adelaide examples. So let's hope it doesn't rain again for the rest of the season.
Winter is coming.
But this is as evidence of how critical winning the territory battle was for Port. They kicked all of their goals. All 11 goals they kicked were from forward half chains, meaning that they won the ball forward of the centre. They chained up from forward of the centre. So that was so critical for them, and there's no question that the wet conditions really, really helped. Not surprisingly, the metres gained, Port had nearly 400 more metres gained with 6,046, that's an important stat for us. Another critical stat, as I mentioned, contested possessions was 152 to 144 their way. Now, that's not a shellacking by any margin. So that, again, is more evidence of, we came to play, we played with effort right through the game. It wasn't one of those games where people should be disappointed, oh, my God, they just didn't turn up, they didn't come to play. None of that stuff. They were just beaten by a team that was, as I said, ferocious, 230 pressure points in that last quarter. As I said, they really dominated in that last quarter. It was so frustrating to watch, wasn't it? So this will come up later, so I don't want to take away from this later discussion. But in the score sources, yes, they won the clearances by 10. So that's a key thing. But they only scored 3 more points than us from those clearances. So, that's hardly a major win. But what is important about those clearances is not what they scored from, is that enabled them to dominate territory. That's what the key thing was, that they were able to dominate territory. So there's a question about whether Goody could have adjusted his setups, and there is a question about that, whether he should be bringing extra to the stoppage, but, to adjust for the weather. So I thought that was really important bit of information in terms of, their territory. The winning by the clearance was really the critical thing. So it's a bit of a misnomer saying, well, they only got 3 more points. Ultimately they trapped the ball in the forward half and they scored off, maybe not that direct play, but, 2 or 3 ones later. So the expected score was 74-97, so 23, which is what it sort of felt like. They were terrific. I thought they performed. Their pressure was amazing, and of course they had a player who just went berserk. So just some curious stats to finish with. Interestingly, they had 30 more marks than us, which probably speaks to partly their interesting in the wet. But also the way that
they were handling the ball better than us all night. You talked about, we're not performing the wet. All those teams that we played against didn't have the same troubles we did, but yeah.
Yeah, but they kept 30 more marks also suggests that they're chipping the ball around and keeping it off us. But what I'm surprised more, not that I didn't really read that much or listen, so I'm not surprised more wasn't made of this. I wonder whether much was made of this. It felt like to me in that first quarter, 6 of those marks were inside their 50 in that first quarter, and we give up something like 10 per game or some crazy number, and we've given up 6 or inside 50, and we'd given up 6 already in the first quarter. And I don't know what it looked like for you, but it felt a bit like their defensive system was a bit out of whack. And I thought I was happy that they weren't further ahead in that first quarter. We seemed a bit the way they were moving the ball forward, and maybe it was because they were pushing from the centre forward rather than transitioning from the halfback flank, and so we couldn't set up. But that for the first time this season, it looked like our defensive system was a bit sort of shaky. Mind you, it came good.
Yeah, it did. They would always just seem to find someone that just didn't have a man, and there were a few times Finlayson was just by himself.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, exactly. So that's both of them, and so they didn't really hurt us. I thought this was interesting because, again, I was worried in that first quarter, but it speaks to a team that turned up. The D's turned up. At the end of the first quarter, ground balls were almost even. In fact, they were even, so we were equal on contested ground ball. And Port were only 2 contested possessions and 2 tackles up at the end of the first quarter. So it's not like they came out and smashed us. It was really those uncontested marks that were really hurting us. Another curious, this must be an awful record that we want to never see again, but we only had 1 clearance at halftime. That is just bananas, like 1 clearance. We've got 2 All-Australian ruckmen, 2 All-Australian mids, and Viney can't get into the All-Australian yet, but will. 1 clearance there's no positive you could put on that, is there?
No, and I know, and we'll talk about this more because we've got a lot on clearances today. It is a worry for me. I mean, I know the post-possession clearance, and we'll get into it, but yeah, it's we've got a star-started middle midfield, star-started rucks, and we're not getting the ball to it. And it is a concern for me.
Yeah, absolutely. So then the final is, and this sort of again goes to my search for data that would sort of that give, other than tracking GPS data, give some indication of fitness, relative fitness. Unfortunately, our record of winning last quarters came crashing to a halt.
Yep.
But we're averaging 41.1 points per game in the time on periods of quarters this season, ranked number 1 in the AFL.
That's good.
We are a red time team. And you'd think that, Port dominated us, some might say. We outscored the Power 24-21 during time on in this game just gone. So not 41 points, but we still scored more than them in the critical time on periods, which again sort of speaks to our effort, our system. There's lots of things that didn't go right. Effort wasn't one of them. And at the end of the day, the critical stat is that we lost the game, but only by 4 points.
All right, well done. We'll move on because we've got a lot to get through tonight.
We've all got opinions and we've all got our own thoughts, but we like to get another take on it. You can get your questions and say through on 0390163666 and via demonland.com. It's time to hear from you with your listener questions on the Demonland podcast.
Well, each week we ask Demonlanders to post their questions and comments in that week's podcast thread on demonland.com. We always read them out. We answer them on the show. If you're just a listener of the podcast and aren't a member of Demonland, then what are you waiting for? Head on over to demonland.com, sign up and join in on the conversations. If you really want to ask a question but aren't on Demonland, shoot us an email at demonland@demonland.com with a subject question for the podcast. You can also leave us a voicemail during the week at 0390163666, 0390163666. If you follow us on Facebook, Twitter or Instagram, just slide into our DMs, ask a question there. We'll keep your name anonymous if you wish. Nairobi Demon asks, was this a good match to lose? While we always want to bank the 4 points, I increasingly think it's not enough to play one decent quarter to win is a better lesson than we can still scrape by playing about one good quarter. Well, I don't know about you, Bim Man, but I'll take a bad win any day of the week over a good loss. I'd rather take the lesson away with a win. I guess I'm looking at that in terms of finishing in the top 4. And for that to happen, you have to bank wins. And if you bank a win with one good quarter of footy, then ultimately I'd be happy with that. It's certainly better for my mood on the weekend, Bim Man.
Well, again, like that's the narrative, one good quarter of footy. I mean, we did have a good quarter of footy.
Yeah.
They played better than us in the other quarters. Yeah. But we brought our effort. So yes, we didn't play great, but it's sort of, let's not fall into the narrative of Melbourne didn't turn up and we were going through the motions. And so, it wasn't great to win. Personally, 7-3 is probably exact. They would have taken 7-3. I would have taken 7-3 at the beginning of the season. I don't think we needed to lose it. There's obviously some lessons. To be honest, I think the big lesson hopefully will be for Van Rooyen, because you could put a case together to say he cost us the game. Now, he won't cop that because he's a young player. And
that free kick, yeah.
2 of them. I mean, really, the two free kicks he gave away were both appalling, really. Let's call it what it is, and arguably cost us the game. Now, I'm hoping that, and both of them really were, he got suckered by Finlayson, I think it was for one of them, and the other one was just ridiculous over committing to the contest. So I'm hoping he will take that lesson away, and the other one I'm hoping McVie will take a lesson away, because he, of what it takes to get through a season and the challenges, and there's lots. I think a lot of those younger players, there's things to take away. It was good to have Salem. He also ran out of gas a bit, I thought. So.
But I thought he was very good. Took a few nice marks in the wet and did a few nice things. So it was
particularly in the first half. It's not. A loss. I don't think that implies we need some sort of wake up call. It's just that we lost the game of footy. If Chandler kicks that goal, we win. Then there's the paper over the cracks conversation. But really, we lost by under a goal.
All right, let's move on. Demon Cat asks, do we need to reevaluate our stoppage setup? I understand that we go -1 at the stoppage or -1 at the stoppage to set up an extra number behind the ball to intercept and spoil, but teams are getting better and better at winning to stoppage clearance, gaining territory and bringing the ball to ground in our defensive 50. The problem is compounded by the fact that our midfield is not winning enough contests. The setup works when our midfield wins contests, but our star-studded midfield seem to be getting beaten every week by young stars like Noah Anderson and Zach Butters, who are hitting the ball at speed and leaving our players outpaced and outnumbered. Long story short, is there any value in equaling or outnumbering at the stoppage to ensure we are winning more contests, winning more clearances and gaining more territory with our star-studded midfield? For a team that is built on contest and territory, we aren't winning either against the better sides. Following on from this, I'd love some discussion on Watson 11's brilliant post on Demonland in the why are we continuously being beaten in clearances thread, which touches on the same point as above with some clear examples of where our stoppage game let us down on Friday night. In that thread, Watson 11 says, is it just me or do others think Friday was an inept coaching performance? I get all the commentary in this thread about having one less at the stoppage and relying on intercept, but wouldn't you think that in Friday's conditions it was a night for territory? But no, Goody stuck with the -1 at stoppage and it was so frustrating. We lost non-centre clearances 30-20. It's why inside 50s were 61-48 and that was the game. The problem is apparent in 2 stoppages in the last 4 minutes. In the first, on our 50-metre arc, Port have a spare which I can live with, but the ball goes down the other end and Port have a stoppage on their 50-metre arc. We had even numbers and put someone goal side, which makes sense, but we leave Port with a spare on the other side. Max can't safely tap goal side, so all night he tapped forward and more often straight to Port's spare. It's just insanity. They had several shots on goal or goal assists from these type of stoppages. It makes no sense why Goody would not push an extra to the stoppage like Port do, as Gawn's tap is never going back towards goal, so we are effectively outnumbered every time. This happened all night and, in my opinion, cost us the game. We need to beat Collingwood this year, who will be +2 at stoppages. Hold on a sec there. +2 at stoppages. Demon Cat then concludes by saying, love the pod, fellas, and hope you bring some frustrated D's fans a bit of hope that we'll get this aspect of our game right sooner rather than later. And well, I don't think you're going to get any hope from me in that respect, as I don't believe we're going to change the way we play at the stoppages. So I'll defer to positive binners in a moment, because for me it's devastating that with our star-studded midfield that we continually get smashed in the clearance. And Binyan, you've always defended this by claiming, and you may well be right, that it's the possession after clearances where we're able to shine and hence able to get possession back. However, in my humble opinion, this is an area of our game where we're not doing well at the moment either in that respect. And I've got no stats to back me up, but I feel that we're not as strong in that aspect of the game as we have been in the past few years. B-Man, can you give us some hope in the clearances department?
I feel like we've been to this movie before, Andy. This one, it was funny watching the game because I saw the clearance numbers and thought, this will be one for the clearance purist. But again, it sort of goes to the narrow. I was really surprised to look at those stats because I hadn't listened to any analysis or, commentary about the game or read anything on Demonland until I'd read Demonland, those stats about clearance. They only scored more 3 points. But Watson's points is exactly right, is that it's their ability to control the territory. But that was specific to these conditions. So what was interesting on the turnover stats, so we're number one, as I said before, in the AFL turnover stats. It was 44 points each. Both teams scored 44 points from turnovers. They got all of their turnovers in their forward half. So that in many ways, the game was the conditions were ideal for Port, and was, I think, the biggest factor in the game. That's my view. Not just because of our struggles in the slippery conditions and that they handled it better, which would indicate they probably got across the board that skill. There was a question last week about should we have a handball coach as well as a kicking coach. It's not a bad thing because it's definitely there's sort of struggles with it, but handballing out of traffic and moving forward is for the same for Collingwood as well, is really important to the way we play footy, and that was made more difficult by the conditions. But territory was the factor, not clearances. Clearances played a big role in the territory, but they won't if we play that game again in dry conditions, we win that game. Of course, I could be accused of being delusional, but it took away our ability to transition from the back half. We still managed 44 points on turnover, which is pretty good, but the ball's in contest. That was with, I thought, really poor performance from Spargo, really poor performance from Cozzy. We weren't trapping it in our own forward half particularly well. So the clearances, you're right, he's not going to stop. And this sort of goes to my point that I was making before about this game versus the big games, the finals. And so I don't know. I've coached basketball. I've coached my son's basketball at a pretty high level. I don't know, haven't done any football coaching, so it comes down to your philosophy, I guess. But we know Goody loves repetition. And so he's not thinking, sure, maybe we might have made some changes. We might have brought an extra to the stoppage. Maybe that might have made a difference in this match. But Goody's philosophy, might be that, well, that actually might cost us a final because every match is an opportunity to practice the setups. There was a time in this season that we brought an extra to the stoppage, and I can't recall which game, but it was when Maxi was out, and I was surprised to hear on the radio call that we had brought an extra to the stoppage at halftime. So it has happened, but it very rarely happens. My own view is that that's an example of Goody. He's trying to implement new systems. He's trying to tweak from last year and develop new patterns. If he's moving those patterns around, how can they learn it? And from my perspective, that's a core Goody philosophy, is that they need to learn the systems under heat. They can practice them in training, all of that, but they need to practice them on game day, because come final, it needs to be instinctive. Come grand final day, it needs to be not thinking. They need to know exactly where they are. And if they're mucking around with that mid-season to win a game, for instance, or to, 4 points in June really won't matter that much. So that would be my view. But you're right; they're not going to change that. They're not going to bring an extra to the stoppage. Well, would it? Unless break glass. That's not Goody style.
We have a caller. Caller, you're on the air. Who am I talking to?
Yeah, my name's Noah from Bentley. Big fan of the podcast.
Hi, Noah. I believe we've got some voicemails to play of you a bit later in the show. How are you going?
Very good. With those voicemails, I just actually wanted to pose a question live to, with the game at Port Adelaide, I felt that bumping of Gawn, which seems to be an ongoing issue, has, slowed him down definitely in this game, and wanted to know the opinion and how we sort of tackle that issue, with Gawn always being targeted as well. But the main issue is, my main concern from the game is that in the heat of the moment, Melbourne doesn't seem to be going that extra mile to win, the tough contest. Yes, it was a tough game on the weekend, but, Brisbane, Essendon, all those games where we've been challenged, we haven't been able to give, that full 100% and go all quarters. Just wanted to know what what everyone's opinion is on it, and whether you think that will change come final time, but especially during the big game with Collingwood.
All right, so Big Man, do you want to talk about Maxi first? I'm not sure what we can do about getting a player getting roughed up. Port's done that to us in the past. They've done it to Maxi in the past. It's a strategy that seems to work for them. Big Man, anything we can do about it?
Well, I mean, as I said at the top, I agree with David King. I would have loved to have seen. I didn't pick up on it during the game, to be honest. Apart from the fact of just furious that another game where he gets hit in the head, the remonstrating other players coming in. Goody might say, look, that happens all the time and we don't want to lose our focus, and that's just a lack of discipline to do that. So, it might be team instruction. I want them to talk to the umpires. I want them to talk and clarify. Well, one, I want clarification. Montagna, he wasn't clear whether it's legal. I want to know whether it's legal to block him 30 metres, 40 metres off the ball as he's running towards the goal. And what can they do about it? Or maybe next time against Port, we can get stuck into those players who are bumping or I'm not sure, it's tough. It makes sense to target Max, but, it has to be done. To be honest, I reckon there's a question about the spirit of the game in there. Maybe I'm over-egging the pudding a bit, but I just hate the treatment he gets. He won't complain. I don't actually mind the blocking so much. What I do mind is the whacks to the head. I mean, he gets hit in the head 4 or 5 times a game. So it was not a great night for anyone who wants to mark the footy, and he's so key, and so is Grundy, and our aerial marking is so critical to our territory game. So, the way we win territory is partly through marking. So, to take Gawn out of action, he's struggling with marking, was clever coaching. So I'll give that to Port.
And Noah,
shouldn't the head be sacrosanct? Isn't that what it's all about? We can't hit people over the head.
Well, it's supposed to be, but no one's ever been reported for any hits on Max, so it's obviously getting under the radar of the MRO, and obviously it's probably not. They're probably not bad enough to get there, but they're certainly doing it. So yeah, the head should be sacrosanct.
And on the pressure and thing, I mean, as I was saying before, I don't agree, Noah. I mean, I think our pressure in this game was terrific, and in that last quarter, that's the point that I was making about our pressure rating in that last quarter. It wasn't like we gave up the ghost and we weren't trying in that last quarter. The pressure rating in that last quarter was, what I had it up before, it was 194 to 205. Keeping in mind, 200 is considered elite. Finals like pressure. We were, 205 in that last quarter, above elite, above finals like pressure. That is incredible for the last quarter by us. So, I just don't agree that we're not bringing that power. We're just beaten by teams. It happens. Good teams beat other good teams.
Well, I hope we beat the Pies on King's birthday. That's all I can say. My father-in-law's a Pie supporter, so it'd be nice just to see them win, even if it's by a point.
I'm hoping like crazy, and I'm hoping we beat Freo this week too. So it's a long season, though, is what I'd say. It's a long, long time. We want to be cherry ripe in September, not in June or July.
All right. Well, thank you very much for joining us live this week on the program, Noah. We do enjoy your voicemail, so thank you. Call in again.
Good on you, Noah.
Thanks very much, guys. Go Days.
Go Red Leggers. Just on the question about coaching incompetence, Andy, one thing I will, I often feel like I'm Goody's cheerleader, but one thing I will question is bringing Tom McDonald in. Particularly with the weather, because I thought Tommy McDonald was poor. That was a good contested mark he took in the last, but he doesn't look right to my eye. That's my big worry, and this is like some sort of weird flashback to exactly this time last year. My big concern for our chances of winning the flag is once again our tall forwards. Benny Brown is clearly not fit enough if they're picking Tom McDonald, who's clearly not fit enough. And I think they made a mistake. They should have picked Smith or Melksham because, Tom McDonald wasn't really bringing the ball to ground JBR, he, arguably maybe they could have given him a rest. He played, a very average game. I thought he wasn't bringing the ball to ground. So our tall setup was all over. I thought that was a huge factor in the game. I just think they pulled the wrong rein, and Smith or Melksham would have been better options than. I know they want that third tall, and that's what they said. That was their rationale. But as soon as it started raining, I thought to myself, "God, we're in a bit of trouble here."
I had received a message on Twitter from Justin Giuliano, who always provides sort of pre-game stats and sometimes some post-game stats for matches. And I usually do repost them on the Game Day threads on D Milan. He's a D's fan and a great follow on Twitter, so do yourself a favour and follow at JT Giuliano. That's at JTGIULIANO on Twitter. I didn't see his message last week until after the show, but I guess it's still relevant. And B-Man, you'll be interested in the stats. Justin says, "Hey, Andy and B-Man, just wanted to throw some stats in on the turnover/clearance game following last week's podcast and why Goody and the team focus so much on the turnover game rather than the clearance. I had a look at our scoring chains from last round's games based on Emlyn Breese's chain chart data on Twitter, and in round 8, teams scored from 64% of their scores from turnover compared to 32% from clearances. The remaining 4% was from kick-ins, so that's league-wide. In our game versus Hawthorn, we scored 77% from turnovers and 23% from clearances, whilst the Hawks scored 45% from turnovers and 41% from clearance, 14% from kick-ins. Last week versus the Suns, so a couple of weeks ago, we were 80% from turnovers to 20% clearances, and the Suns were 45% from turnovers and 48% clearances, 7% kick-ins. Seems like a smart game plan to focus our efforts on scoring and defending turnover, given that's where the majority of scores in the AFL come from, rather than clearance, although clearly can't ignore this. So you've always said we're more important in the scoring from turnovers than clearances, but you look at the stats and the teams we play against are sort of 50-50 turnover and clearance against us, but we're clearly...
But there's a correlation, obviously, because of how we play, because we give up clearances because of that not bringing one to the stoppage. And that's exactly what he's saying is exactly right. And that's what the point is about the use of analytics, is that was what I was saying last week that Daniel Hoyne from Champion Data was saying is, I think, was it you get twice as likely to score from a turnover as you are from a clearance. So logic suggests that analytics would say you are better focusing in the long run, in the over the journey, not in an individual match, on scoring from turnovers, which is exactly where we focus, because you will win, you will score more that way. And we have been. So all of the clearance conversation aside from this game, remembering they only scored 3 more points than us from clearances. Yes, they won the territory because of their clearance domination, but they didn't smash us on the scoreboard in clearances. We are still the highest scoring team in the AFL. So it's like, it's like weekly amnesia. So that's just the real stat. It's like data that anyone can look at just by looking at the ladder. We are the team that scores the most. So the focus on turnovers over the journey, which is how the analytics works, and it makes sense, doesn't it? So in this game, we both scored 6 goals, 8-44 from turnover. I was mentioning this before, and we scored 32 points from clearances, and they scored 35 points and 44. So much closer to 50-50, which tells us this doesn't look like a Melbourne game. It didn't work for us. I would argue a big factor is the wet conditions, because our turnover, once we win them, so we win the contested ball, say on our halfback flank, or we force a turnover dump kick to lever because we put intense pressure on the ball carrier. From that point, we need to transition to score to make that valuable. We need to transition from the halfback flank or deep in our D50 to a score, and that the way we play, that involves chains of handball, and they're hard to chain up when it's wet.
I'll read this out. I think we might have answered it. Ross Millen also wants to talk clearance and possession after clearance, but with a slant towards the wet conditions on Friday night. He says, B-Man, you often talk about being happy to lose clearances with the aim to get the opposition on turnover. How is that strategy impacted by wet and slippery conditions, and what tweaks are needed? It seems intercept marking in defence on wet, slippery days is near on impossible. So does this make the tactic less useful?
Yeah, it does, I think. And it really goes back to Watson 11's question about was there mistakes by the coaching panel not to adjust the game plan for the conditions. So it's sort of the two sides of the same coin, that question, I think, with Watson's 11 comment. And I don't know. It's like, I don't know what the answer to that is. It depends on your coaching philosophy. You could say, I don't know, that's my point about not being a footy coach. So there's no right answer to that other than this is what I might do if I was the senior coach of an AFL team. But Goody clearly doesn't do it. So should he? I don't know. Maybe, maybe we can ask him, get him on the podcast and ask him,
that's my goal.
It's that balance, isn't it? Well, it's the balance between how much it's the same question about why they didn't tag Butters. Now,
we have a question
about that. It's a reasonable
so.
argument to say we should have tagged Butters, but we don't tag. So now Goody might argue, well, we're never going to tag in the final, so why are we practicing tagging Butters now? And someone else might argue, because we might have won the game if you had.
Yeah, well, we also want to finish as high as possible to give us the best chance. I don't want to go to Port and play them in a final. That's for sure. But anyway.
So it's really about a coaching philosophy, and if you've got a different one, then you'll disagree with him, I guess.
Oh My D says the physicality of the game and the conditions in which it was played made the loss of Tom Sparrow through suspension all the more significant. Whilst the loss of one player likely makes no difference to a result, to what extent would Sparrow have helped us in the clearance contest around stoppage and giving our mids a rest through rotation during the game? And I guess there's no doubt given the condition, Sparrow would have been a very handy rotation through the midfield, particularly given Clary's hammy issues. And I'm not sure if his inclusion probably wouldn't have made a difference, as OMD said. But big man, young swallow, Tom Sparrow, would have been a handy inclusion.
I totally agree with that comment. I don't know if it made
a difference.
Would have been more than a handy inclusion. It was huge, and that goes to my point about how important he is, and how it's easy to miss his importance. One example of why we really missed him was they went to really put a lot of work, and they flagged this. They really put a lot of work into Viney, and really looked to minimise Viney's impact, which was hugely important on a night was so slippery where you'd hope that that's where Viney would shine. So that was really clever coaching, I thought, by Hinkley. Having Captain Jack in the team would have mitigated against that, because he could have run with them. He could have run more time as the in and under mid and let Viney go to the sort of half forward flank like they use Wines. They would have had much more flexibility, because they always need one of those two in the midfield. The two best in and under hard ball winners, probably. Oliver and Track in that conversation too, I guess. So I thought it was a huge out. It was a really, really big out, I thought.
Monoculus says, guys, excited as always and looking forward to the podcast. Few would question that we have at least a couple of elite midfielders, Track and Clary, with others nearby, Jack Viney and up-and-coming Sparrow. But does a group of elite midfielders make an elite midfield? What indeed is an elite midfield? Surely that would require generating meaningful clearances or forward entries. Is our midfield as a group rather than as individuals elite? I guess that's an interesting question, but there's no doubt our midfield was largely responsible for the onslaught that turned the momentum in the 2021 grand final.
And in the third quarter of this game.
Yeah, that gifted us a groundbreaking flag. And no doubt that individually, Clary and Track are superstars of the competition, both the top five in most MVPs across various media outlets. Viney is not far behind them in terms of his importance to our team. He certainly provides a lot of grunt work. And having said that, do they do enough damage as a unit, particularly in the 2023 landscape? We've talked about us not being damaging in our clearance game. We probably don't get enough goals from them. Having said that, both track. I think track's second, and I think Clary's fourth for score involvements. So they're generating scores. Big should we even be questioning the elite status of this midfield as a unit? It seems heretical to even suggest that. Our record, although our record against top 8 teams isn't stellar over the past 2 seasons, and we'll talk more about that later, but your thoughts on this midfield as a unit?
Well, it all depends on your metrics, doesn't it? And if your metrics are bloody clearances, well, yeah. Again, we've scored more than anyone else in the competition. Round 10 is a pretty good sample size. You know, we're elite in the midfield. And I'm sorry, my previous effort at curing your MFCSSS was woefully not helpful, but I've got a simple solution for you. Just watch the third quarter again, Andy. Just watch that. Don't worry about the result. Don't worry about the fact that we ended up losing the game. Just go watch and if you really don't want to watch the whole quarter,
but that makes me more frustrated because I know we can do that. I want to see more of that.
Put it in a bubble that first 20 minutes and go, wow.
I'll just watch the grand final.
That is a midfield. That is a performance. That is incredible. We've got a fella who shouldn't have been playing track with his ankle. Yeah. We've got Oliver who goes bananas. That was a phenomenal. That was our power. That's how good we can be against a team that was up and about in Port. So you know that few teams can do what we did in that third quarter. That power split. So yes, very much. We've got an elite midfield. All Australians. We're going to have 3 All Australians in our midfield: Maxi, Track, and Viney.
All that does is make me wish we did it more. Queen Bee and D Demon asks, why wasn't Viney sent to Butters? Bizarre. Can you enlighten me, please? D for Life adds, Cozzy was quiet on Friday night. Butters was on fire. Why not throw Cozzy onto Butters and say, go beat him one-on-one, particularly with Oliver's hamstring issue late in the third? Well, look, those individual moves that they may have had some impact, and I know that our coaching department don't often attempt to negate, as you just mentioned, the opposition, and they trust the process. Before we look at any individual moves that we might have made, I'll read out the next couple of questions about our in-game coaching and in-game moves. Rivers Runs Red says, gutted with the loss, outplayed for 3 quarters, but find respite in the fact that we lost by 4 points. Adding to this, they had a bloke play the highest rated game for the year, got some calls their way, and still we only lost by 4 points. I wanted to convince myself that this is unsustainable and we will be okay and that our method will get us through, but I'm getting more shades of misfiring 2022 Ds than a team that deserves to be second in the flag betting. One of my Tiger mates said after our flag, it gets harder now. Teams will hunt the Demons, get pride from beating the Demons. I think about this way too much. Rant over. Love the pod, guys. And Buck Necked adds, hey, guys, a great Friday night for neutrals. A tough final styles hit out in May. Port always smack Max around, so not unusual. They bought the pressure and a clear plan to beat us. We played 1 great quarter, 1 average, and 2 poor quarters of football. B-Man doesn't agree. I can see him shaking his head. And still only lost by 4 points. I don't want to beat up on the team. A bit worried that we don't do much planning or in-game changes as we trust the process. Butters getting off the chain, targeting our marking, making Lever accountable, not changing up the midfield until halftime, etc. What do you guys think of the trust over change coaching model, and are we still on the path to going deep in September? Look, I get the trust the process model that we employ, but I'm also baffled that we don't appear, at least from my perspective, to make changes or many changes in game to negate opposition. Man, you've said why we don't. This trust the process model also encompasses my concern, again, my opinion, that we don't change the way we play or set up in order to beat a particular opposition like other clubs do with their homework on negating our strengths. I think a lot of clubs do that, so they're obviously changing their patterns. Rivers Runs Reds, mate, is right when he says the teams will hunt the Ds. We saw it last year. We're still seeing teams do their homework on us to beat our system. And I'm in no way suggesting that we as a club don't do our homework, but sometimes you do have to perhaps change the way you play, in particular in the game, to negate your opposition and during the game when the match isn't going your way. And Big Man, you said you're in the trust the process. We've got to do what we need to do, what we're going to be doing in September now, so that it's second nature in September. But I just think that we do need, sometimes we need to negate the opposition. I'm not saying you have to tag, but I don't know.
Well, you're not alone, Andy. I mean, lots of people have the same view. And I mean, I've said this before about coaches. A couple of years ago, we were talking about this. There's, I think there's 2 or 3 different types of coaches, and the one end of the scale is the goodie who is the system. Like and that's where the game's heading. And again, that's credit to Richmond. That's, they really cemented that notion. Then you get coaches, probably Hinckley's somewhere in the middle, but who will do lots of scouting and using players and specific tactics like the blocking of Max and going after him and doing those sorts of things, but he hasn't won a flag, has he?
No.
Has Hinckley won a flag? No, he hasn't. So
they won't even sign him up after 7 straight wins.
That's right. So Goody's won a flag and I don't know. I don't know what the answer is. I don't have a philosophy on this. I just know what Goody does. Whether I think it's what he should do, I don't know. It's like, would you like to do it? He was asked that question. So one of the things I did watch in the media, because I always watch the post-match presses, is he was asked that question. And his answer, he said, well, why didn't you do anything? Goody, obviously it's in his brain. I think I'm right in saying that he only had 17 possessions He had 17 possessions in the second half. They didn't tag him, and we almost snatched the game from them in the third quarter. And to be honest, that's where I thought we're 17 points up, and I thought we were going to kick away. That last goal turned the game. That stupid free kick at the end of the third quarter, and then Finlayson scored the first goal of the last quarter. That was the game right there. If we kicked away when I think we had a shot, if we'd got out to 4 goals, we win that game of footy. And Goody's point is that they didn't. They trusted the system, and we almost won the game despite he was phenomenal, wasn't he? He was brilliant, and his ball handling skills was a great game, individual game of footy. I guess it all depends on where people view their own coaching philosophy on the answer to the question.
Lazy says, last week I asked about our tackling pressure through the middle of the ground, and I thought this week we were exposed in this area. The overall tackle stats was 75-72 the way of Port, but I think the nature of the wet game and more overall tackles inflated our stats a bit. We were often faced with the issue of a running opposition midfielder getting through the middle far too easily without enough pressure or defensive ability to stop them in their tracks. What can we do? Do we need to get the mouth guards out at training this week? Do we need to set up differently when defending in transition? Appreciate the thoughts. And I noticed this too, the ease of which our opposition was able to cut through us in the middle of the ground. It was a concern for me last week as well against the Hawks. The bigger concern, though, this week was the lack of our forward pressure. Last week we praised the fact that we were back at number 1 for tackles inside forward 50. We're now 4th and Port are 1st on the back of losing that stat to Port this week, 18-6. So tackles inside forward 50. B-Man, were you aware that we lost that 18-6?
Oh, I didn't know that it was 18-6, but that's what it looked like, didn't it? And that was really my knock on Spargo. Maybe Nibbler as well. I don't know what his tackles do, but I thought Cozzy had a really, really poor game, and I found myself for the first time in a long time. I was getting up and about by myself in the TV room, but really a few times I found myself yelling, "Come on, Cozzy, what are you doing?" I thought his efforts also looked a bit sort of not his usual zip either. So he's so important to our inside 50 pressure, isn't he?
Kicked a beautiful goal.
And so look, as I said, the pressure numbers don't bear out the notion that they were waltzing through us. And I think another important factor about our defence is the inside 50 they won by 13, 61-48. So 61 inside 50s, they didn't score that well. And so our back line stood up pretty well. I would say it's our forward line pressure again, which was the issue this time last year, remember. The critique was our low pressure. Just the thing on Buck Necked's comments, you're right. He's right. We had some poor quarters. We had one great quarter, 2 poor quarters, 1 average one, I thought.
That's what he said.
But my effort the effort was okay. The effort of the team was good right throughout. The performance wasn't great in terms of our ability to get forward and to win clearances and do those things. But the effort was there right through the game, I thought.
Travi14 says, interested to hear Ben Mann's take on our small forwards, as I know he loves all of our small forwards. I think we are playing one too many and they are thinking each other will put pressure on and then nobody does. All three, Spargo, Cozzy and A&B, clock up the kilometres and each have something to give. A&B endurance, Cozzy goal kicking and speed, Spargo ball use. A&B and Cozzy had shocking games on the weekend in a game where the ball spent more time on the deck. No Oliver for a while. I think one of those small forwards, I think he meant one of those small forwards needs to go and a midfielder to come in, whether that's Harms, Laurie, JJ or someone else maybe. Dr. Gonzo then added that Travi14 forgot Chandler and Travi replied correct, although in my opinion he's the only one that gets to stay in. B-Man, that was a question for you. So where do you sit on our small forwards? And I know you just said Cozzy had a poor game, Nibbler.
And Chandler. I don't think Chandler was particularly good either. So my answer is no. I think that the setup's the setup. And
do we have one too many small forwards though?
No, I don't think so.
Again,
it depends what you're looking at. Are you looking at 10 games of footy or you're looking at the game that just happened on Friday night? You know, we're the highest scoring team in the AFL. I've said it 3 or 4 times, but it's true. And you don't do that unless you're small forwards. We've are kicking goals. We've also got the biggest spread of goal kickers in the AFL. You don't do that unless your small forwards are contributing. The other question I would be putting into that mix, to be honest, is Fritter. Fritter, I thought he had another average game. And it was interesting to hear talk about him maybe carrying an injury.
Well, I thought he played he came up the ground a little bit and got the ball a couple of times. Maybe that was in the third quarter.
I reckon he got half of his possessions
up the ground.
The wing.
Yeah. So he was at least doing that, and he's kicked 2 goals. But yeah. Well, there is
just on the.
Sorry. Go ahead.
Just on the clearance numbers again.
Back to the clearances. Yes.
And the question about our elite midfield and how good our midfield is, and all of that discussion, I'd like to put on the table that there's a risk of D's wanting their cake, fans wanting their cake and eat it too, because this time last year, people were complaining about the fact that it was always Viney, Track and Oliver at our forward setup. So they completely changed that year. So we've gone from mid-80 centre clearance, centre at ball, whatever you call it.
Centre bounce attendance.
Yeah, to mixing it around, to bringing other players through there. And if you do that, there'll be less often we'll have our best midfield in the middle. So therefore we're not as likely to win clearances. We could, if we wanted to jack our clearance numbers up, you could just run Track, Oliver and Viney into the ground and have them at every centre clearance. But last year fans were critical of Goody for not running more players through the midfield. There's always going to be a trade-off, isn't it? If you're running Rivers through the midfield, who's not necessarily the best midfield in the world, or even Cozzy, although it was interesting, he didn't get any midfield time, I don't think. Maybe a couple.
Cozzy?
Yeah.
I believe he was in the middle a few times.
Was he? Got the?
I don't have Willow's rating, but I definitely saw him. We'll move on. The Chief says, can't stomach the concept of watching a replay of Friday night's game. I'm with you there. But it seemed to me that for our kick-ins from points, Port went hard one-on-one defensively, so there were no easy kick-ins, short or long. We seemed to just accept this, and there were virtually no leads given to the person kicking out, which resulted in the predictable long bombs to the wing where we got slaughtered and the ball was locked in their forward 50. Conversely, we used a mixture of one-on-one and zone defence when they did their kick-ins, and they moved the ball far too easily from their defence to forward 50, helping them dominate time in their forward half. After watching Port's successful strategy for our kick-ins, the idea of going a hard man-on-man defence for the opposition's point kick-ins looks like a winner to me. We can still adopt a zone defence when the ball is in general play. What do you guys think? Ross Millen adds, I had the level 5 Riverbank seats on Friday, which is the equivalent to the Ponford stand seats. I was very concerned that we struggled to exit our defensive 50 and our point kick-outs are so predictable. Port had a number of successful set plays that allowed them to exit much easier. Do we need to alter kickouts when it's wet, or have a few more strategies to upset the opposition's defensive zone? Well, tactically, I can't say that I'm an expert on kick-ins. The long kick up the wing always frustrates me, particularly when we're doing it all the time. And I've liked that this year that we've mixed it up a little bit this season with the short kicks. But I guess the weather this week and Port's one-on-one defensive setup for kickouts put paid to that strategy. So we had to predictably go up the line. Bimam, what are your thoughts on the strategy of kick-ins offensively and I guess defensively? And also if you want to answer Ross's query about altering the strategy for wet conditions, if you have any ideas.
Yeah, look, it's a genuinely interesting question. We don't, should we change the way we play for wet conditions? Again, Goody doesn't, does he? Should he not? I'm not sure. I don't know. Let's say he should. I can't remember whether I thought we talked about this last week, but perhaps we didn't because you didn't mention it, and maybe I read it on Demoland during the week. But there was a stat put up on a tweet from one of the football commentators about exactly this issue, saying that we score from that more often.
There was an article during the week. I can't remember which publication it was in or which website, that we're the best team at kick-ins. Yes, there was.
Yeah, and that from that kick-in, that I forget the actual, so I'd be making it up, is that the point of the tweet or the article was that, again, it's another example of analytics, is that whilst people find that boring, no one scores against us going back the other way, and we score more often from that point, from kick-ins, than any other team in the AFL.
I think
So its whole point was that strategy that we employ is effective, and the analytics demonstrate its effectiveness. So that's why Melbourne keep doing it. Should we keep doing it in the wet? I don't know.
That was prior to this week. What these people are saying is that this week they matched up.
Of course it was prior to this week, but that's my point. So
they did their homework and they worked out what we've been successful at, and they adjusted the way they played during the week.
No, it was raining, it's obviously there's a variable that's not there. So they didn't, look, maybe they did. Maybe they looked at that. But the point remains, a lot of these points swing on the same thing, is, okay, let's wet weather footy. Goody doesn't do that, should he? I don't know.
No, well, Goody's philosophy, obviously, even if there isn't, I'll just say we're coming up and playing Fremantle this week, and they've got something that they do. Our philosophy, or Goody's philosophy, isn't we're not going to try and negate what they do. We trust in our systems, and we believe that we will beat them.
The point to the thingo is that's a good example, is he continues to instruct his team to kick to that point because that's what we do, because that's what the analytics show. But it's only logic to suggest that a system that at very least is somewhat dependent on getting 3 or 4 marks from those marking contests, T-Mac clunking them, Max clunking them, stopping the ball in its tracks is much more difficult when it's wet. Should we abandon that strategy because it's harder to mark it? Goody doesn't do it.
I'm not so – I don't really agree with them. I think we had to kick up the line. It was a wet game. We needed territory. We needed to kick it as far up the wing as possible.
And I guess the sort of other part of that question, it's the same sort of space, isn't it, is should we adjust our game plan similar to what you're saying, regardless of whether it's to the conditions or to the opposition or should we do more of it?
And I'm not talking wholesale changes of our game plan. I'm talking tweaks. Dino Rover says, thanks for your efforts on
Can I just say with that often I think this is where the game's going to evolve, hopefully, in terms of understanding the analytics, just like it is in American sport. Just like it's because now in American sport, people, there's lots of truisms that people assume are wrong. So part of the point of that article was that, Melbourne fans get bored with Stephen May kicking to the point. Well, the whole analytics demonstrated it's the most effective way to move the ball forward. Just the other point, by the way, around us getting cut up from Port moving it back, they didn't cut us up on transition. They scored all of their scores from winning the ball forward of centre. So they didn't hurt us on transition. Again, it's I think it's a really interesting discussion around coaching philosophy. It's just Goody's going to frustrate D's fans.
Well, I just hope that the footy department isn't changing things just because we're bored of a certain way. So.
Yeah, that's right.
Dino Rover says, thank you for your efforts on the podcast. I ask that you consider how strong our ruck division is. Heretical, I know. Sean Darcy is the benchmark, apparently. AFL stats comparisons show he is way ahead of Max and Brodie on hit-outs, stoppage clearances and centre clearances. True, he's one player and we have two rucks, but Freo also have a relief or chop-out ruck option, which is delivering something we're not rucking. Then there is the work our rucks do when not in ruck contests. My challenge is to the prevailing orthodoxy that our two ruck system provides us with a competitive advantage. What do you think? Well, B-Man, we're a dual rucking team. Both of our rucks do a lot of work around the ground. We aren't having to pull someone from another position to chop out. I think stats comparisons with a team that only uses one ruck is unfair against a 50-50 rucking combination.
Well, I mean, they use two. They use Jackson.
Yeah. What's the split? And we'll talk about that.
I'd be guessing 60-40.
Yeah.
60,
I don't really watch them. I'm just looking at their results.
I think it's an interesting interesting question, but I'm not sure about not the running and how the combination. Although I would say it's still a work in progress, really, isn't it? The sort of on-ground relationship between Max and Grundy.
Absolutely. They're still, because Max had all that time out, it's sort of still tweaking. Yeah. Plus, we haven't had that settled forward, tall forward structure. So it's
The bit of the problem is similar to Freo's problem is Grundy's best as just a pure ruckman. I reckon that's where he plays his best footy. But what does that mean for Max? And how do you manage that? What I'd say about Darcy is that he's an absolute gun. He is a fantastic ruckman, and you could see that 2 or 3 years ago which way he was trending. I reckon I'd have him right up. I'd have him second, maybe third behind Maxi English, and then Darcy, or Darcy'd be pretty close to Pippi English as well, I reckon. So, it's a good question. He's a fantastic ruck, so it's going to be brilliant this weekend. I can't wait to see how that all shakes out.
Well, we'll get into that soon. AMAC says, I've heard a lot of people comment that Ed Langdon isn't going well across this season to date. Overall, his attacking stats are definitely down compared to 2021 and 2022. And that was as of a couple of weeks ago, he says. Disposals are 19.3 this year versus 21.4 and 21.8 in 21-22. Meters gained 304 versus 376 and 417. Marks 3.6 this year versus 4.1 and 5.4. Insides 50s 2.4 versus 2.8 and 2.8. The only stat backing this trend is goal assists, which have doubled from previous years, 0.8 this year versus 0.4 and 0.3. But his defensive stats are up. Tackles 2.6 versus 1.3 and 1.9. 1%ers 1.4 versus 0.9 and 0.8. The exception is turnovers 3.6 versus 3.8 and 4.2. I haven't been able to make it to the games this year, so interested in your thoughts if A, Ed is down on form, B, he's carrying a niggle or simply less fit than previous years, or C, he's simply changed role to a more defensive one and is no longer a key linchpin in our preferred ball movement in 2023. And I think, AMAC, it is, yes, you just answered the question in your third point. The stats seem to back that up as well. Ed is definitely being used more defensively this season. We discussed it, B-Man, last week on the podcast, and one of our listeners noted that he's getting back to fill holes in defence. This is coupled with the inclusion of another more attacking winger in Lockie Hunter, which was basically the genesis for that role change. And previously, all of our attacks were through the Ed Langdon wing. That's no longer the case with Lockie Hunter in the side. Plus, we no longer solely are going wide to the wings. We're looking inboard more. Bin man, Ed Langdon, he's not down on form, you wouldn't say, and he's just playing a different role this season, yeah?
Yeah, that spot on from AMAC's comments, particularly as you say. I think he's right in that third point. That's exactly my perspective on it. And I think, as you say, it's just changed. These roles changed, and we're using Hunter differently. I mean, and it's a bit of cake and eat it too, isn't it? Because people were criticising Melbourne for being so myopically looking for the one wing and kicking down his, and then the criticism is that you take Langdon out of the game, or you're halfway to beating Melbourne. we addressed that issue. We've got Hunter, his roles changed. And just to say, well, think of it, Andy, that I read that question. So that was the media I read was the questions in this, the podcast thread on Demonland. So I'd read that, and it's just great to read that sort of. One of the things I like about these questions is that the consideration and all the other ones as well. Drilling down on something that's of interest to someone is fantastic, because I didn't, have a sense of those numbers at all. I hadn't looked. So I think AMAC's spot on there, and remains a super important player for us, doesn't he?
Yes, he does. Dr. Gonzo says, since our glorious drought-breaking flag, we have a less than stellar record against top 4/top 8 opposition. Have we been freed from desire? We seem to have lost the hunger and pressure that was a hallmark of our 2021 campaign, namely around stoppages and inside 50s. I guess our form against top 4 and top 8 oppositions, I said it before, it's a huge concern of mine. It's a massive roadblock, I think, going deep into September, let alone winning the whole thing. From the thread on Demonland, which is called Record versus Top 8, started by Demonland Praha. Since starting 10-0 last year, we've gone 4-10 against top 8 sides at the time of the match. We've won 2 against Brisbane last year. Freo last year, we won in Freo. Bulldogs in the round 1 game. We lost to Collingwood, lost to Sydney twice. Bulldogs once in 2022. Brisbane twice. That was in the final and the round 2. We've lost to Port now. Freo in that corresponding game last year, and Geelong in Geelong. Obviously, Sydney isn't top 8 now, nor is Freo, but at the time they were good teams. Port starts playing well, and we put in a shocker. If we include Essendon, who looked finals calibre at the time, then our record is 4-11. You simply don't win flags with that record. That was Praha on Demonland. Big man, as I already stated, it's a massive red flag for me. Dazzle Davey in that thread said beating all those bottom 6 sides is just putting a Band-Aid over the cracks. Big man, are you concerned about our record, our abysmal record, I will say, against the competition's best? And I don't want you to hear that the bookies still have us as second favourites for the flags, because you should gamble responsibly.
I mean, they're pretty damning numbers, I guess. Going back from when? When
it's 2020, basically 2022. Since 10-0. Since
no, that's from
this time
21, right? So
no, not 21. Round 10, 2022. Since after the 10-0.
Well, what I would say is, why are we looking back last year?
It's 4-11.
Right, so let's look at this year, right? So with the back half of our season last year, do we want to relitigate all of that? I mean, we were the walking wounded. Okay. 11 players apparently carrying serious injuries. That accounts for the Brisbane game that we lost. It accounts for the Sydney game that we lost. That's 2 of them. We beaten by the Pies. We should have been 6-7 goals up at half time. We ran out of gas in that game. So let's worry about this season, not last season.
Then we're 1-2 against top 8 teams this year. And we
so let's worry about this season, not last season.
1,
because
2, 3, 4 of the others.
Counter. Let's go back to 21. Why aren't we counting 21 in those stats? And let's go back maybe even further. So I just think that, you could probably chase down any sort of stat like that. What was Geelong last year at this stage in terms of beating top 4 sides?
Praha.
So, I take the point. It's but let's worry about this year, not last year. So, that's what I'd say. So I think that it's a bit of a fool's errand to look back and say round 10 and say, for instance, we beat the Dogs, but they weren't in the finals at that stage because it was the first round. But that's a good scalp. Like I said at the beginning of the season, they were my Boulder, and they're looking good. So they're a top 8 side now, aren't they? So that's one. Sydney were at the time. They were top 8 at the time we beat them. But now you look back in round 10, you go, well, they're not top 8 anymore. Does you count that as a top 8 win or not? So you can only, look at each individual game. the question I would have more is I think our pressure is fine, is whether, the systems and the game plan is effective against the top teams. I just think those sorts of, it's a bit like you could make a case for anything with the right set of numbers, couldn't you?
All right, well, we'll bring this back up in 4 weeks' time.
Freo in the 8, they're not in the 8 yet, are they?
They're not in the 8, so hopefully Geelong are out of the 8 in a few weeks. All right, let's move on because we're getting late in the program. We've still got a few things to talk about. We'll quickly run through just the Casey game. In a high-scoring affair, the Casey Demons defeated the now 9th place North Melbourne by 15 points despite the injury and suspension woes at AFL level. The Kangaroos twos have been in good form lately. Melksham, Shackey and Smith booted 3 each, whilst Ben Brown booted 2. After being the tactical sub for Narrm, James Jordan finished with 27 disposals and 8 clearances. In defence, Tomlinson took 10 marks and had 24 disposals. Daniel Turner took 13 marks and had 22 touches. And rookie Jed Adams took 7 marks. Bailey Laurie kicked 2 goals from 22 touches, whilst Wowie Jr. kicked a goal from his 23 disposals. Harms had 21 and 8 clearances, and Blake Howes took 9 marks and had 18 possessions. According to Casey from Casey, Deacon Smith had a good game. Andy Beniz-Wakefield was prominent early, and Ollie Seston had some impressive moments and kicked a great goal too, taking on multiple opponents. Matt Jefferson kicked a goal and had a few cameo moments. Casey has a tough challenge next week as it takes on Werribee at Avalon Airport Oval next Saturday. You didn't watch that?
I watched the second half, and Disco
quickly.
Turner was just absolutely fantastic in that second half. I wouldn't be surprised he comes in on the back of that performance. And I didn't see any of the first half, but Smith had kicked 3 in the first half, I think.
Yeah. That's what he ended with.
But none in the second half, I don't think.
Took an absolute screamer as well. Did you see the photo of that?
No, I haven't. Yeah. I haven't.
They chased it up.
So, yeah, it'll be interesting, really interesting. Selection's going to be fascinating this week.
We'll get to that shortly. Demonland track watcher Kev Martin ventured down to Gosh's paddock to bring us the following training report from Monday's session. Light duties for Ben Brown, Jake Bowie, Fritsch and Hibbo. Oliver at the time wasn't training. Petty in rehab. Harms in full training. No sign of Varel. Kai Turner joined the main group after individual warm-up. So did Ben Brown and Bowie. Then Kai Turner went back into rehab. When asked how's the mood and feel of the players, Kev replied, focused, all gathered together, and as they were out late onto the paddock, I presume the review of the last week's match was extensive. Oliver has turned up now and is in the shed doing some exercises with a trainer. When asked about the status of Luke Dunstan, who it should be noted is still listed as 1 to 2 weeks injury on the injury list, Kev replied, took a while to spot him, but Dunstan is in full training mode. I think they are testing him out physically, one of the last to leave the paddock and doing some low ball gets. So despite the 1 to 2 injury on his knee that they say, I wonder if he could be an option in a week or two for Clary. On Oliver, Kev says he's moving okay, but only short movings, no strapping and feeling the top of his left quad. Oliver has entered the field now, doing some resistance work and also going a bit harder. Now a bit more, does some switching with his steps, looking comfortable, all smiles, and Petty, who is close by, gives him a hug. Oliver has put on stretch strapping and doing some slow 50-metre run-throughs under a timer. Carrying a ball, doing small kicks. Track has a hand slap with him, looking positive and on the low side of grading. I'm sure he's talking about the grading of the injury. Had a chat to a volunteer after the session. He reckons Oliver will be out for 4 weeks, JJ or Harms to come in, and that Dunstan is still struggling with his knee. The club physio was right next to Oliver, guiding him through some stretches and hip raises, also feeling the area where the leg bone meets the hip bone at the front. After this assessment, he went and did some short, easy run-throughs with some sideways movement, talked to the physio, and after putting on an elastic support, had numerous, at least 10, slowish 50-metre timed run-throughs. When asked about Petty, Kev replied Petty was in rehab doing simple exercises and no running. When asked about Fritsch in rehab, Kev replied, Fritter didn't do much training, some work with the resistance band and leg stretches. This has been his normal weekly preparation for some time now. When asked how Petraka is looking, referring to his ankle and that we will need a big game from him this week, Kev replied, first out and last off the paddock. And that's the training report from Kev. So it's going to be a
interesting.
while.
What's Oliver doing? he's a bit of a renaissance man. He's a resistance fighter. Was that what
those resistance bands they put
work?
on? They put these bands up between their thighs or whatever, and legs or ankles or whatever, and do.
In his part time, he's a resistance fighter. But it's weird, isn't it? That I thought it was curious that he's training at all. If he's done his hammy. If I've done my hammy, I'm not doing anything. I'm not doing the dishes.
Yeah, but there's obviously some. I think maybe there's some awareness of something, and the scans are maybe inconclusive, but I don't think they can rule out a tear. And I don't know if he's already. Yeah,
it's more of the we haven't talked about it much this season, but drives me nuts. This sort of rubbish with injury, just anyway. It's not let it go that one.
Let's move on. We'll get to changes and we can talk about because I want to ask you about Oliver in a sec. The D's took changes. D's took a massive blow with the news that Clayton Oliver could miss up to a month with a hamstring injury from Friday night's match. Jake Bowie is also listed as a test for the calf injury that saw him subbed out of the match. Now, before we get into changes for this week, B-Man, how massive is the blow of Clayton Oliver missing for perhaps the next month, particularly against the opposition that we have coming up in that next month, Freo, Carlton, Collingwood, and perhaps even Geelong, but that game is after the bye, so it's a bit of extra time. How do we cover him? Can you cover him?
No, well, you can't replace him with someone as good, but I'm not particular. 4 weeks is 4 weeks. That's sort of, you're going to lose some players during the year. Of course, the one I'm really spewing about is him not playing against the Pies.
Yeah.
The caller, the comments, I'm desperate to see us beat the Pies this year. For him not in that, I'm gutted he's not going to be playing that game. I'm not fussed otherwise, particularly. Particularly this week, if we're on and we bring the sort of pressure we brought in this game and don't beat Freo, well, then my MFCSS will be triggered, and it won't be because Oliver isn't playing. If we can't beat Freo without Oliver, then there's some question.
I sort of want us to lose just to see what that looks like.
Yeah. What will be interesting this week a little bit is that those younger players are fatiguing. Bowie was the other one. I've forgotten about him. I was going to mention him going out with that threw us out down back. And last year, people were screaming out on Demonland for rest some of these players. It'd be interesting. JBR had a shocker, I reckon. As I said, he arguably cost us the game. Love the young fella's effort. Maybe does he need a rest? Do you bring a Shaki in for him, or does Chandler need a chop out? Does McVee, who looked like he really needs a chop out, he looked gassed. Does he need a chop out? That's there's some interesting questions, particularly with the Collingwood game. Soon. So they'll be hopefully keen to have their very best 22 on the park. So maybe we do manage some players this week.
Well, Doug Remus says, let's assume Oliver, Bowie and Hunter don't play against Welly Allop. So Hunter, did you hear the news? He's failed his appeal.
I didn't hear that, no.
He failed the appeal. I don't know whether the D's are going to appeal the appeal. Like we did.
What else could he have done in that circumstance? Isn't that what you're supposed to be doing?
I'll quickly read out to you what their the reasoning was. This is the tribunal's findings. We find that Hunter was not contesting the ball. Eyes were on Rosie and not the ball as he shaped his body sideways. His hands were not reaching for the ball as he shaped his body sideways. He was not attempting to pick the ball up. He was not attempting to trap the ball. Even if we were to have concluded Hunter was contesting the ball, we would have found it was not reasonable for him to contest the ball in that way. He knew or should have known that Rosie was coming towards him at speed. He was reaching for the ball, he was low, and as a result of reaching for the ball, his head was exposed. He could and should have positioned himself in a way so as to minimise impact to Rosie. If the question of the reasonableness of the manner of the contest was alive in this matter, it would be because we had found that despite not attempting to pick up the ball, Hunter was contesting the ball. There were ways he could have done so that would have greatly minimised the risk of injury to Rosie and presented no real risk of injury to Hunter. He could have remained front on and adopted an arms out position to try to trap the ball while absorbing and minimising the impact to Rosie. The alternative submission was that the bump or forceful contact was caused by circumstances outside of the control of the player which could not be reasonably foreseen. We reject the proposition that the circumstance of Rosie tapping the ball instead of attempting to gather the ball could not reasonably be foreseen. So I don't know, just doesn't make sense to me. But
well, at the time,
what could he have done?
It looked like to me, Rosie ran into Hunter,
and he just stood his ground.
I mean, if he was front on, he could have done more damage with his knee. Or
what should he have done? Jumped out of the way and let Rosie see ya, go have a goal.
Yeah. It'd be interesting to see would they appeal.
Well, I don't know. We haven't said anything yet. I don't know. We'll see.
Yeah, so let's assume
let's assume he's out. He's out. Oliver Bowie, Hunter out. Sparrow. So Doug Remus says, who would you bring in? He says, I'd be bringing in Sparrow, Jordan and Harms, send Brayshaw to the wing where he almost won a Norm Smith, make Woden the sub, get some young blood in there. Also, I didn't think T-Mac did much, but he showed he still has it in him, just needs to get involved earlier. Horrible night for a key forward coming back in. So big man, I guess, changes this week. Who comes in for Oliver? Who replaces Bowie if not fit? Who replaces Lockie Hunter if we can't get his suspension reversed, which we haven't so far.
Sparrow comes back in. JJ comes back in.
Yep.
Whether that's sub, that's a stupid. They should I totally agree with Goody that they should just make it the 23 and select the 23 and work it out from there. Or have the
coaches think that
clear. Yeah, have the 4 players on the bench. I'm a huge T-Mac fan, but I'd drop him. I thought and I would look to bring. Well, personally, I'd like to say Smith in. Shaki might be a chance. Howes, I reckon, is a real chance of coming in. I don't like the idea of Brayshaw being the wing. I mean, it does create a problem with Salem coming back in about where Gus then plays. But for all the people who want to see more of Gus in the middle, I don't think he had a great game in his midfield time in this game. He's just not quick enough over the ground and he's not impactful enough. And so as a midfielder, personally, I think Howes might get a go to come in. He's saying it would be a natural fit for the wing position to replace Hunter, I reckon. He's had a good couple of weeks, obviously the bye previously in Casey, but his previous game was good. His game was good on the weekend. I suspect that they might give him a run, but as I mentioned, I'm not sure how well Disco Turner played in the first half, but his marking in the second half of that Roos Casey game was fantastic. And just on sort of selection integrity grounds, he must be some sort of shake to get in. The other thing on my list of things to ask you was Petty. We also lost Petty into that game and Sparrow in addition coming into that Port game. So, there were some factors against us, that's for sure. I'm going to be fascinated to see because I could also see McVie getting dropped on the grounds of being managed. Maybe that's too many changes. We're starting to get up to too many changes.
Which we don't do.
He doesn't like making them. So,
all right. Let's move on to the preview versus Wallyallop. I think that's how you pronounce it. Apologies if it's not. Early in the season, D's fans were on Fremantle Death Watch and were gleefully delighted in the fortunes or lack thereof of Freo due to the D's being the custodians of their round 1 and round 2 picks in the national draft as a result of the Luke Jackson trade. After starting the season 2 and 5, the Dockers have steadied the ship and won their last 3 on the trot, comfortably defeating last year's premiers, the Cats, by 5 goals on their home deck. In the corresponding match last season at the G, the Dockers, this week called Wallyallop, as part of the Sir Doug Nicholls round, they handed Narrm their first defeat in 11 matches, a loss that started a 3-match losing streak going into the bye. It is also the first time former Premiership Demon Luke Jackson will face his old club. And before we discuss the upcoming match and any likely matchups, Ross Millen wants to know, how do you see the Jackson versus Gawn matchup, and do you expect any of the team to target Jackson? And I doubt Luke will be the number 1 ruck, so Gawn is likely firstly to match up on Sean Darcy. That being said, at some point, Gawn will likely square off against his former Padawan. Big man, how do you see the matchup between former master and apprentice, and do you think Jacko will cop it from his former teammates and, I guess, the crowd as well, for that matter.
I don't think they'll cop it. Why? It's. I think Goody'd be furious if they jumped into him, unless there was a reason to jump into him, because it's about discipline, really, isn't it? So why would we target Jackson if it's in any risk of putting us off it? When does that work, really? When name one occasion when it works, opposition gets into, with a clear tactic at the beginning of the game.
Well, a few oppositions have been doing that to the Nick Dacos.
Exactly. It doesn't really exactly. So they won't see much of each other. I don't reckon Gawn and Jackson, because it'll predominantly be Jackson v Grundy. I'd reckon. In terms of, and Darcy versus Max. That's going to be the critical contest. He's been great in the last 3 weeks, Jackson. I've watched their games. I've watched all of their games so far.
Well, it's good because I haven't.
So yeah, and they're looking a lot better. They've got this model now. They're really trying to move the ball with long handball. The number one handball forward. Number one for metres gained from handball in the AFL, which is a curious stat, but it really describes how they play, and they like to use the width. Some numbers here for the clearance people who back to the clearance, is that they're fourth in the AFL for centre clearances per game, which
for fuck's sake.
So I thought that was funny in terms of that. So we'll see, and they're number one in the AFL for hitouts. And they're looking a lot better. They're moving the ball a lot better. Their defense, they've got a very similar system to us defensively, and I reckon they've modelled our defense. But I think you can get pulled apart a bit, not least because they're 18th in the AFL for clangers. So that's going to, this is an interesting one, because the two game styles don't mesh or sort of have so many of the similarities that, say, Port and Melbourne do in terms of that forward half stuff and wanting to get it forward, but do have other similarities. The two rucks move the ball from the half-back flank, but they turn the ball over a lot. So that's going to really feed our turnover game, I think. So a lot of it will come down to, particularly because they score from clearances. It's a big scoring. It is for Brisbane as well. For most teams, scoring from clearances is a huge factor, a bigger factor for them than for us. So in many ways, that's going to be the critical contest, Darcy and Jackson versus our two All-Australian ruckmen. And then, of course, what we can do in terms of putting pressure on their clearances, so we don't give them any clean clearances when they do win them, and then we can feed off their feed off the intercepts and get our game, as Goody will say, we want to get the game looking like our game. Obviously, they'll try. 18th in clangers is not top four, final eight sort of quality football from them. So that, to me, would be a massive worry if I was a Freo fan. I just looked at the weather before. There's chance of showers, 20%. So,
what app are you looking at? My app that I just looked at has clear. We're playing Saturday, correct?
I'm looking at the Bureau of Meteorology, and it says partly cloudy, high chance of showers about the Dandenongs. Medium chance elsewhere, 20% chance of rain.
This has on
degrees,
Saturday.
Maximum 16, cloudy.
This has 0 millimetres of rain. On Saturday, the total precipitation will be 0 millimetres.
Well, I'm looking at the Bureau of Meteorology.
This is a Australian weather app.
What do you read? Weather.com or something?
I don't know. I'm getting rid of it.
So hopefully it won't be slippery. But the good thing is that it won't feed. It will hurt their game as much as it will ours if it's slippery.
I need to get a new app on my phone. New weather app. All right.
2:10 on a Saturday afternoon with a red Sharon. I cannot wait. Yeah. I'm really, really, really looking forward to this match. I've seen some fantastic games at the D's versus Freo. One of my favourite all-time ones was in a wet conditions where we came back from 45 points in that last quarter to roll over the top. That was the last game my son The last game, my son and I went to a game of footy. He basically stopped supporting after that. I'm not sure what happened. So he went out on a high.
Well, there you go. That's the way to do it. Well, I think we're going to leave it there for tonight. We'll be back next week at our regular time on Monday night at 8:30 p.m. If you want to listen to the show live, please join us then at demonland.com, Monday, 8:30 p.m. Thank you to our 5-star reviewers, Demon Dave and Biggest Jimus. Thank you to our callers, Kieran from Canberra and Noah from Bentley. Thank you to our Demonland posters who submitted questions and comments. Thank you, Nairobi Demon, Demon Cat, Ross Million, Oh My D's, Monocular, Queen Bee and Demon, D for Life, Rivers Run Red, Buck Naked, Lazy, Travi14, Dr. Gonzo the Chief, Dino Rover, AMAC and Doug Reamer. And thank you to Kev Martin for his training report. And also a thank you to Justin Giuliano for his stats. Thank you to my co-host B-Man. Thank you to you, our loyal listeners. And don't forget to leave us a 5-star review and a comment on Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts from. We'll read it out on the next podcast. See you next week. Go Demons.
Relegers.
Come on, demons. Come on, demons. Come on, demons. Come on, demons. Come on, come on, come on, come on, demons. I've got this feeling, I know